My son said I'm always breaking things. So I broke the silence and transferred the $1.2 million. The words still echo in my mind. 3 months later, as I sit in my new apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, watching the sunrise paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and amber I'd forgotten could be so beautiful. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this story sounds familiar, please, just leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep sharing these truths that so many of us carry in silence. My name is Margaret Rose O'Sullivan, and I'm 76 years old. For the past 18 months, I lived in a converted tool shed behind my son's house in Evanston, sleeping on a cot that squeaked every time I shifted my weight, listening to mice scratch inside the walls while my family lived in comfort just 30 feet away. The shed smelled of damp wood and forgotten dreams, with one bare bulb hanging from a wire that cast shadows that danced like ghosts of the life I used to know. Every morning at 5:30, I'd wake to the sound of Aaron's alarm clock through the thin walls of the main house. I'd lie there for those precious quiet moments before the day began, before I had to transform myself into the grateful, undemanding mother they expected me to be. My arthritic fingers would trace the wedding ring I still wore. 47 years of marriage to Charles, gone now for 3 years, leaving behind memories and a bank account my family had slowly learned to access. The routine never varied. I'd dress in the same 3 outfits I rotated through the week, clothes that had grown loose on my shrinking frame, purchased from the clearance rack at Target with the small allowance my son gave me from my own money. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. At 7, I'd knock gently on the back door, waiting for permission to enter the house I'd helped buy with the life insurance money Charles left me. "Morning, Mom?" Aaron would grunt, not looking up from his phone as he scrolled through stock prices and sports scores. His wife Claire would offer a tight smile while buttering toast for their 16-year-old son Tyler. My grandson, who'd stopped hugging me months ago, as if age were contagious and my presence might somehow diminish his youth and vitality. I'd make coffee for everyone, the way I'd done every morning for 5 decades. First for Charles, then for my children when they lived at home, and now for the family that housed me like a charity case. My hands shook slightly as I measured the grounds, not from fear, but from the medication I took for blood pressure. The pills I paid for with money Aaron accessed through the banking app Tyler had helpfully installed on my phone. The kitchen was beautiful. Granite countertops I'd never dreamed of affording, stainless steel appliances that gleamed under recessed lighting, a farmhouse sink deep enough to wash the dishes I broke with increasing frequency. My depth perception wasn't what it used to be, and my fingers didn't grip things the way they once had. Each broken plate or dropped glass brought the same response from Aaron. "You're always breaking things, Mom. Do you know how much that cost?" I'd apologize, bend to clean up the pieces while my hip protested, feeling the weight of their disappointment settle on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Claire would sigh and make a note in her phone, probably calculating the replacement cost, adding it to whatever tally she kept of my transgressions and expenses. After breakfast, if I was lucky, they'd include me in their plans. Usually I spent the day alone in the shed, reading library books or watching the small television Tyler had given me. His old one, with a screen so scratched I had to squint to make out the pictures. I'd think about Charles, about the diner where I'd worked for 42 years, pouring coffee and serving pie to truck drivers and office workers who called me honey and left dollar tips that added up to the down payment on our first house. That life felt like someone else's story now. The woman who'd raised 3 children, who'd worked double shifts to pay for soccer cleats and prom dresses, who'd sat beside hospital beds and celebrated graduations and walked her daughter down the aisle when her father was too proud to do it himself. That woman seemed to have evaporated somewhere between Charles's funeral and the fall that broke my hip and shattered whatever independence I had left. But that Tuesday in October, everything changed. I was sitting in the shed, reading a romance novel about a woman who finds love after 50, when I heard voices through the thin wall that separated my space from Aaron's home office. Claire was on the phone with someone, her sister, I think, and her voice carried that particular tone people use when they think they're not being overheard. "The power of attorney papers are ready," she said, and I heard the rustle of documents being shuffled. "Aaron says she'll sign anything if we tell her it's for medical emergencies. She trusts us completely." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The romance novel slipped from my fingers and landed with a soft thud on the concrete floor. Power of attorney. Medical emergencies. The casual way Claire discussed manipulating my trust felt like a physical blow to my chest. "How much do you think is left?" Claire continued. "Aaron thinks maybe 800,000, but with the pension and Social Security, we could be looking at over $1 million total. Enough to pay off the house and maybe get that cabin up in Wisconsin we've been talking about." I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. 800,000. They'd been tracking my finances like vultures circling roadkill, calculating not just what I had, but what I'd be worth to them over time. The life insurance money Charles left me, the savings we'd accumulated over 4 decades of marriage, the pension he'd earned working 30 years at the steel plant, all of it reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet that would fund their dreams while I lived in a shed, grateful for the privilege of washing their dishes and cleaning up my own mistakes. That night, I lay on the cot that had been my bed for 18 months, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of some foreign country I'd never visit. The shed was cold. They'd promised to insulate it before winter, but winter had come and gone, and nothing had changed. I pulled Charles's old cardigan tighter around my shoulders, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that still clung to the wool after all these years. I thought about the woman I used to be. Margaret O'Sullivan, who'd survived the Great Recession by taking on extra shifts, who'd outlasted 3 different owners at the diner, who'd negotiated her own raises and stood up to handsy customers and difficult bosses. When had I become this timid creature, apologizing for taking up space and grateful for scraps of attention from my own family? The answer came to me in the darkness. I'd become this person the moment I'd convinced myself that being alone was worse than being used. The moment I'd chosen their grudging acceptance over my own dignity. The moment I'd decided that any family was better than no family, even when that family saw me as nothing more than a financial resource to be managed and depleted. But lying there in the cold shed, listening to the autumn wind rattle the loose siding, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being grateful for crumbs, done apologizing for existing, done pretending that love could be bought with compliance and gratitude. Tomorrow, I would start breaking things on purpose, starting with the silence that had been slowly killing me, piece by piece, day by day, for far too long. The next morning, I woke with a strange clarity, as if the fog that had clouded my mind for months had suddenly lifted. But first, I needed to understand how I'd gotten here. How a woman who'd once managed a household budget, negotiated with car salesmen, and stood toe-to-toe with doctors about her husband's care, had become someone who asked permission to use the bathroom in her son's house. It started 3 years ago, the day we buried Charles. Aaron had been so helpful then, so concerned about his grieving mother. "Don't worry about anything, Mom," he'd said, his arm around my shoulders as we stood beside the fresh grave. "I'll take care of everything. The insurance paperwork, the bank accounts, all of it. You just focus on healing." I'd been grateful, overwhelmed by the complexity of death's paperwork, drowning in forms that required signatures and decisions I wasn't ready to make. When Aaron offered to handle Charles's pension paperwork, I'd signed the authorization without reading it carefully. When he suggested I might want to simplify my banking by consolidating accounts, I'd nodded and provided the information he needed. "It's what Dad would want," he'd said, and that phrase became his magic key to every financial door I owned. The first request came 2 months after the funeral. Aaron's air conditioning had broken during a brutal Chicago heat wave, and the repair would cost $3,000. I hate to ask, Mom, but with Emma starting college next year, my daughter lived in Portland then, struggling with her own mortgage after her divorce. Aaron had always been the stable one, the responsible one who'd never asked for help before. I wrote the check without hesitation. Family helps family. 6 months later, Tyler needed a car for his 16th birthday. Nothing fancy, Aaron assured me. Just something safe and reliable. The reliable car cost $18,000, a sleek Honda that Tyler drove like he'd earned it himself. When I mentioned the price seemed high, Aaron frowned and said, "I thought you wanted Tyler to be safe, Mom. Would you rather he drive some death trap?" The guilt was expertly applied, like a surgeon's scalpel. Clean, precise, effective. Then came Claire's medical scare, a suspicious mammogram that turned out to be nothing but generated weeks of anxiety and several expensive tests not fully covered by insurance. The stress is killing her, Aaron explained, and the medical bills are overwhelming. She's been so good to you, Mom. So welcoming. I remembered Claire's tight smiles, her careful politeness that never quite reached her eyes. But I wrote another check, $4,700. Each request came with its own justification, its own emotional manipulation carefully crafted to make refusal seem selfish and heartless. When Aaron's company restructured and his position was eliminated, I helped with the mortgage payments for 6 months while he looked for the right opportunity. When that opportunity turned out to be a pyramid scheme selling essential oils, I quietly covered the losses without saying a word. "You're so generous, Mom," Claire would say, her hand briefly touching mine across the dinner table. "Tyler's so lucky to have a grandmother who cares so much about his future." But I began to notice things. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The glances Aaron and Claire exchanged when I asked about my bank statements. The new furniture that appeared regularly. A leather sectional, a dining room set, a massive television for the basement. "Great deals," Aaron would explain. "Claire's really good at finding sales." My own needs became afterthoughts. When my prescription glasses broke, I made do with reading glasses from the drugstore for 3 months because Aaron was waiting for his commission check to help me with the optometrist. When my winter coat finally gave up after 20 years of Chicago winters, I wrapped myself in Charles's old cardigan and told Aaron I was fine when he noticed me shivering. "You're so low maintenance, Mom," he'd say with approval. Not like Claire's mother, always complaining about something. I'd learned to take pride in being low maintenance, in being grateful, in never being a burden. It became my identity. The selfless mother who asked for nothing and gave everything. The fall happened on a Tuesday in March. I was leaving the library, arms full of books, when I missed the step leading down from the entrance. The crack of my hip hitting the concrete was audible to everyone within 50 feet. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like lightning shooting down my leg and up my spine. At the hospital, Aaron held my hand while the doctor explained the surgery I'd need, the months of physical therapy, the uncertainty about whether I'd walk normally again. "Don't worry about the cost," Aaron whispered. "Insurance will cover most of it, and we'll figure out the rest." But insurance didn't cover everything. The bills arrived like a paper avalanche. Surgeon fees, hospital charges, physical therapy costs, medications, medical equipment. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, the numbers inside growing larger and more intimidating. "I don't want to be a burden," I'd whispered to Aaron from my hospital bed. And I'd meant it. The idea of draining my savings, of becoming dependent, of requiring care instead of providing it, it terrified me more than the pain in my hip. "You could never be a burden, Mom," he'd replied. But I caught him looking at his phone, checking messages, his attention already elsewhere. When I was discharged, Aaron presented the solution. I'd stay with them while I recovered. "Just until you're back on your feet," he'd promised. "The guest room is all ready for you." But when I arrived, the guest room had been converted into Claire's yoga studio. Meditation cushions covered the floor where a bed should have been, crystals lined the windowsill, and the smell of patchouli incense hung in the air like broken promises. "Change of plans," Aaron said, not meeting my eyes. "We fixed up the shed out back. It's actually really cozy. Private. You'll love having your own space." The shed was 8 feet by 12 feet, with plywood walls and a concrete floor. A cot, a folding chair, and a card table constituted the furniture. A space heater provided warmth, and an extension cord snaked through a hole in the wall to provide electricity for the single overhead bulb. "It's temporary," Aaron repeated, but temporary stretched into weeks, then months, then seasons. My recovery was slow and painful. Physical therapy sessions I couldn't afford, medications that made me dizzy and confused, appointments I depended on Aaron to drive me to because the shed was too far from public transportation. Each service came with subtle reminders of its cost, gentle suggestions that perhaps I was pushing too hard, taking too many appointments, requiring too much care. "The insurance company is asking a lot of questions," Aaron would say, shaking his head over paperwork I couldn't understand. They think some of these treatments might not be necessary. I began to doubt myself, to wonder if my pain was real or imagined, if my need for help was legitimate or selfish. Aaron's sighs when I asked for rides to appointments grew heavier. Claire's offers to pick up my medications came with increasingly obvious reluctance. "Maybe you could try managing with fewer pills," Claire suggested one evening. "I've been reading about natural pain management, meditation, aromatherapy, much healthier than all these chemicals." I nodded and smiled, eager to please, desperate not to be more trouble than I already was. I cut my medications in half, then in half again, lying awake nights with pain shooting through my hip while Claire practiced yoga in the room that should have been mine. The financial conversations became more frequent and more direct. Aaron needed access to my accounts to pay my medical bills, he explained. It would be so much easier if he could just handle everything directly, rather than bothering me with every small expense. "You trust me, don't you, Mom?" he'd ask. And what could I say? He was my son. He was helping me. Of course I trusted him. Tyler, my grandson who'd once spent weekends at my house building model airplanes and learning to bake cookies, became a stranger who grunted responses to my questions and disappeared into his room whenever I tried to talk to him. When I asked Aaron about it, he shrugged. "Teenagers. You know, he's got a lot going on. School, girlfriend, college applications. He doesn't mean to be rude, but I'd seen Tyler laugh with his friends, watched him joke with his parents. The rudeness was reserved specifically for me, as if my presence embarrassed him, as if having a grandmother in a shed somehow diminished his social status. The breaking point should have come earlier. Should have been the first time Aaron snapped at me for dropping a dish, or the first time Claire made a cutting comment about my clumsiness, or the first time I realized that my own money was being spent on luxuries I'd never touch while I lived in conditions that wouldn't meet standards for pet housing. But I'd been trained so well to be grateful, to be undemanding, to accept whatever scraps of affection and attention were thrown my way. I'd convinced myself that this was what family looked like, that love sometimes came with conditions and requirements, that my worth was measured by my usefulness and my silence. It took overhearing Claire's phone conversation about power of attorney papers to realize the truth. I wasn't family anymore. I was a resource being systematically harvested, my trust and gratitude the tools being used to strip away everything Charles and I had worked 47 years to build. That night in the shed, as autumn wind rattled the walls and I pulled Charles's cardigan closer around my shoulders, I asked myself a question that changed everything. Was I being used? The answer came swift and clear, like a bell tolling in the darkness. Yes, completely, systematically, and deliberately used. And tomorrow, I decided, that was going to change. The question haunted me through the sleepless hours that followed. Was I being used? As dawn crept through the single window of the shed, painting everything in shades of gray that matched my mood, I began to see my situation with terrifying clarity. Every interaction, every request, every moment of the past 18 months took on a different meaning when viewed through this new lens. I thought about my 76th birthday 3 months earlier. I'd woken that morning with the foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd remembered. That there might be a small celebration, a cake, even just a card acknowledging that I'd survived another year in a world that seemed increasingly designed to erase women like me. Instead, I'd spent the day exactly as I spent every other day, alone in the shed, reading a library book while the family went about their routines as if nothing was different. At dinner, when I finally gathered the courage to mention that it was my birthday, Aaron had looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, wow, Mom. Sorry. I've been so swamped with this new client proposal." He'd glanced at Claire, who was feeding their cat. The same cat that was forbidden from my shed because it might mess up the storage space. "We'll have to do something special this weekend." The weekend came and went without mention of my birthday. When I brought it up again, Claire had smiled that tight smile and said, "We were thinking maybe next month, when things settle down. Make it more special, you know?" Next month never came. Or the time I'd caught a cold that turned into bronchitis. For 3 days I'd lain on the cot, coughing so hard my ribs ached, running a fever that made me delirious. I'd texted Aaron, using the phone Tyler had upgraded for me, asking if someone could pick up cough medicine from the pharmacy. His response came 6 hours later. Can't you just tough it out? Claire says most coughs are viral and medicine doesn't really help anyway. I'd eventually walked the 8 blocks to the pharmacy myself, stopping every few yards to catch my breath, dizzy from fever and medication. When I returned, Claire was in the backyard hosing down her car. Feeling better? She'd asked cheerfully, as if I'd been faking illness for attention. That same week, I'd overheard Tyler on the phone with a friend. Yeah, my grandma lives with us, in the shed. I know, right? It's so weird. My mom says she's getting senile and can't live alone anymore. Senile. The word hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't senile. I was isolated, demoralized, and deliberately kept out of important conversations and decisions. But to Tyler, to his friends, I was just the crazy old lady living in the backyard shed, too far gone to deserve basic human dignity. The microaggressions were constant, so frequent I'd stopped noticing them until that night when everything clicked into focus. The way Aaron would speak to me like I was a child who couldn't understand complex concepts. Mom, I know this is confusing, but just sign here and I'll handle everything. The way Claire would rearrange things in the kitchen after I'd cleaned up, as if my way of doing things was inherently wrong. The way both of them would have entire conversations about family plans, vacations, renovations, Tyler's college visits, without including me or even acknowledging my presence. I was a ghost haunting my own family, but the financial discovery was what broke me completely. The morning after overhearing Claire's phone conversation, I waited until Aaron left for work and Claire drove Tyler to school. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I walked into the main house without permission and headed straight for Aaron's home office. My hands shook as I opened his laptop. He'd never changed the password. It was still Tyler's birthday, the same combination he'd used for years. The banking websites were bookmarked, passwords automatically saved. Within minutes, I was looking at my own financial life spread across the computer screen like an autopsy report. The numbers made no sense at first. My savings account, which should have contained over $800,000, showed a balance of $37,000. My checking account was overdrawn by $400. The pension payments Charles had worked 30 years to earn were being direct deposited into an account I didn't recognize. I scrolled through months of transactions, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Payments to luxury car dealerships, high-end furniture stores, expensive restaurants, a $15,000 home improvement loan that had apparently funded the kitchen renovation I'd been excluded from planning. Monthly transfers to something called Tyler's College Fund, amounts that exceeded what most families earned in a year. My own medical expenses, the bills Aaron claimed were overwhelming, represented less than 5% of my total healthcare costs. The rest was being paid by Medicare and my supplemental insurance, policies Charles had insisted we maintain even when money was tight. I'd been subsidizing their lifestyle for 3 years while living like a vagrant in their backyard. The evidence was all there, meticulously documented in spreadsheets Aaron had created to track his management of my finances. He'd labeled it Mom's Asset Management, with subcategories for household contributions, family support, and care expenses. My life had been reduced to a business plan with projected depletion dates and contingency strategies. In a folder labeled Legal Documents, I found the power of attorney papers Claire had mentioned on the phone. They were already prepared, needing only my signature to give Aaron complete control over every financial decision I might make for the rest of my life. Below that, a document titled Long-Term Care Options that outlined strategies for accessing my remaining assets while minimizing their own legal liability. They'd been planning to have me declared incompetent. The cruelest document was titled Mom's Quality of Life Assessment. It detailed my declining cognitive function, my increasing physical limitations, and my adjustment difficulties following Charles's death. Every moment of confusion, every stumble, every time I'd asked them to repeat something I hadn't heard clearly, it was all there, recorded and interpreted as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. Aaron had been building a case against my competency for months, documenting every sign of normal aging as proof that I couldn't manage my own affairs. The shed wasn't just convenient housing, it was isolation designed to accelerate my decline and limit my contact with anyone who might question their version of reality. I printed everything. Page after page of evidence that my own son had been systematically stealing from me while convincing me I should be grateful for his care. When the printer ran out of paper, I took photos with my phone, the same phone Tyler had helpfully set up with banking access that Aaron had been using to monitor and control my spending. By the time I heard Claire's car in the driveway, I'd documented enough financial fraud to send my son to prison. But more than that, I'd uncovered the cold calculation behind every kindness, every sacrifice I'd been asked to make, every guilt trip that had convinced me I was lucky to have family willing to tolerate my presence. That evening at dinner, I sat at their table, the table I'd helped buy with my own money, and watched them eat food purchased with my Social Security benefits while they discussed their plans for Thanksgiving in Aspen, a trip that would cost more than I'd spent on groceries in 2 years. "You'll be fine here by yourself, won't you, Mom?" Aaron asked, cutting into the steak I'd paid for. "Mrs. Henderson next door said she'd check on you." I nodded and smiled, the way I'd been trained to do. But inside, something had crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. I excused myself early, claiming I was tired, and walked back to the shed where I'd been living like a refugee from my own life. I sat on the cot with the financial documents spread around me like evidence at a crime scene. Each page represented a betrayal so profound it took my breath away. This wasn't just about money. It was about the systematic destruction of my dignity, my autonomy, my very sense of self. For the first time in 3 years, I cried. Not the quiet, careful tears I'd shed in darkness when the loneliness became unbearable, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal and raw. I cried for the woman I'd been before Charles died, before I'd convinced myself that any family was better than no family. I cried for the years I'd lost being grateful for crumbs when I deserved a seat at the table. But most of all, I cried because I finally understood that the choice wasn't between being alone and being with family. The choice was between being alone and being systematically destroyed by people who were supposed to love me. When the tears finally stopped, I felt empty but strangely peaceful. The fog that had clouded my thinking for months had lifted completely, leaving behind a clarity that was almost painful in its intensity. I picked up my phone, the phone they'd given me to control me, and dialed a number I hadn't called in over a year. "Ellie? It's Margaret. I know it's late, but I need to ask you something. Do you still have your paralegal license?" Ellie Martinez had been my friend for 40 years, since our children were small and we'd met at the playground. She'd worked as a paralegal until retirement, specializing in elder law and financial fraud. We'd drifted apart after Charles died, partly because Aaron had made it clear that my social activities were an inconvenience to the family schedule. "Margaret, of course I do. What's wrong? You sound used," I finished. "I sound used, and I need your help." That night, for the first time in 18 months, I slept peacefully. Not because my situation had improved, but because I finally knew what I was facing. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my life from people who'd convinced me I didn't deserve one. Tomorrow, I would stop breaking dishes and start breaking the chains they'd wrapped around my heart and mind and bank account. Tomorrow, Margaret O'Sullivan would remember who she used to be. Ellie arrived the next morning at 9 sharp, driving the same reliable Honda Civic she'd owned for a decade. I watched from the shed window as she pulled into Aaron's driveway, her silver hair pinned back in the no-nonsense style I remembered, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen countless legal battles. She was smaller than I remembered, more fragile-looking, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made her one of the most respected paralegals in Cook County before her retirement. "My God, Margaret," she whispered when I led her into the shed. Her gaze swept over the concrete floor, the single bare bulb, the cot with its thin mattress and threadbare blanket. "How long have you been living like this?" 18 months, I said, and hearing the words out loud made them sound even more impossible. A year and a half of my life vanished into this 8 by 12-foot box while my son and his family lived in luxury purchased with my money. Ellie set her briefcase on the card table and opened it with the precise movements of someone who'd spent 40 years organizing evidence and building cases. "Show me everything." For the next 2 hours, we spread documents across every surface in the shed. Bank statements, transaction records, the power of attorney papers, Aaron's quality of life assessment. all of it laid out like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture too ugly to believe. "This is systematic financial elder abuse," Ellie said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The power of attorney fraud alone could send him to prison for 10 years. And this," she held up Aaron's assessment of my mental competency, "this is character assassination designed to justify theft. Every single transaction here is illegal." But as Ellie explained my legal options, we heard the front door of the main house slam shut. Aaron was home early from work. "Margaret?" His voice carried across the yard, sharp with irritation. "Where are you? We need to talk." Through the shed's single window, I could see him standing on the back porch, hands on his hips, scanning the yard like a prison warden looking for escaped inmates. He spotted Ellie's car in the driveway and his expression darkened. "Stay here," I told Ellie, my heart hammering against my ribs. "This won't be pleasant." I walked across the yard slowly, my arthritis making each step a small act of defiance. Aaron's face was flushed with anger, a vein pulsing in his temple that I remembered from his teenage tantrums. "Who's here?" he demanded before I'd even reached the porch. "And why didn't you ask permission to have visitors?" Permission? The word hit me like a slap. When had I started needing permission to see my own friends in what was supposedly my temporary home? "It's Ellie Martinez," I said calmly. "You remember Ellie. What does she want?" Aaron's eyes darted toward the shed, calculating, suspicious. "And why is she parked in our driveway without asking?" Our driveway. Not the driveway of the house I'd helped purchase, but theirs. Everything was theirs. The house, the car, the decisions, the money. I was just a tenant whose lease could be revoked at any moment. "She's helping me with some paperwork," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "What kind of paperwork?" The question came out sharp and fast, like a verbal attack. "Mom, you know I handle all your legal stuff. You don't need to involve outsiders in family business." Family business. As if my life, my money, my future were corporate assets to be managed by the board of directors. "Actually, Aaron, I think I do." The words came out stronger than I'd intended, and I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe. Or the first hint of fear. For 18 months, I'd been the compliant mother who never questioned, never challenged, never demanded anything beyond basic survival. This new version of me was unfamiliar territory for both of us. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly." His tone shifted to the patronizing gentleness he used when he wanted to convince me I was confused. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe we should make an appointment with Dr. Patterson, get you some help with the anxiety." Dr. Patterson, Aaron's golf partner who'd prescribed increasingly stronger medications every time I'd mentioned feeling sad or confused. Medications that made me foggy and compliant, easier to manage and control. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months," I said. Claire appeared in the doorway behind Aaron, her yoga outfit pristine despite the fact that it was nearly noon. She took in the scene with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a potential threat. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Mom's friend is here," Aaron said, not taking his eyes off me. "Apparently they're doing some kind of paperwork." Claire's smile was glacier cold. "How nice that you have a visitor, Mom. But next time, maybe give us a heads up. We like to know who's on our property." Their property. The reminder was deliberate, designed to put me back in my place. "Of course," I said. But something in my tone must have betrayed the change happening inside me, because both Aaron and Claire suddenly looked more alert, more cautious. "Well," Claire continued, "I'm sure whatever it is can wait. We actually need to talk to you about something important." They led me into the kitchen. The kitchen I'd helped renovate with my own money but never been consulted about designing. Aaron gestured for me to sit at the island while he and Claire remained standing, creating a subtle but unmistakable power dynamic. "Mom, we've been thinking," Aaron began, using the tone people use when they're about to deliver bad news they want you to believe is good news. "Your living situation isn't working out the way we hoped." My blood turned to ice. Were they planning to kick me out? Put me in some cut-rate nursing facility where I'd be even more isolated and controlled? "The shed was always meant to be temporary," Claire added, her voice dripping with false concern. "And honestly, we're worried about you out there. The isolation isn't good for your mental health." mental health. The setup was so obvious it was almost insulting. First, isolate me in conditions that would damage anyone's psychological well-being. Then, use that damage as evidence that I needed even more control and supervision. We've been looking into some really nice assisted living facilities, Aaron continued. Places where you'd have people your own age to talk to, activities, medical care on site. Much better than living alone in a shed. The best part, Claire added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, is that they handle all the financial arrangements directly. No more worrying about bills or bank accounts or any of that confusing paperwork. You could just focus on enjoying your golden years. Golden years. In a facility where they'd have complete control over my remaining assets while I lived on whatever allowance they deemed appropriate. Of course, Aaron said, pulling out a folder I recognized from his home office. We'd need to finalize some legal documents first. Nothing complicated, just standard power of attorney papers so we can handle the transition smoothly. There it was, the trap they'd been setting for months, maybe years. Get me to sign away my autonomy voluntarily, then warehouse me somewhere I couldn't interfere with their systematic looting of my life savings. I see, I said quietly. The papers are all ready, Claire said, producing a pen with the flourish of someone delivering a gift. We just need your signature and we can start making arrangements. I looked down at the documents, the same power of attorney papers I'd seen in Aaron's computer files, the ones that would give him legal control over every financial decision I might ever make. The print was small, the language deliberately obscure, designed to hide the magnitude of what I'd be signing away. For a moment, I felt the old impulse to comply, to trust, to sign whatever they put in front of me because they were family and family wouldn't hurt me. The conditioning of 18 months of psychological manipulation pulled at me like quicksand. Then I thought about Ellie, waiting in the shed with evidence of their systematic theft. I thought about the luxury car purchased with my pension money while I lived without heat. I thought about Tyler calling me senile to his friends while wearing clothes I'd unknowingly paid for. I need to think about it, I said. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Aaron and Claire exchanged a look that lasted a fraction of a second but spoke volumes about their coordination, their shared understanding of how to handle this unexpected resistance. Mom, Aaron said, his voice taking on an edge I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. There's really nothing to think about. This is what's best for everyone. I said I need to think about it. The words came out stronger than before, and I saw Aaron's jaw clench. He wasn't used to being told no by anyone, least of all by the mother he'd been manipulating for 3 years. Margaret, Claire's voice carried a warning wrapped in false sweetness. I hope you're not letting outside influences cloud your judgment. Sometimes people who haven't been involved in a situation don't understand all the complexities. Outside influences. They meant Ellie, of course. Anyone who might show me evidence of what they'd been doing. Anyone who might support my right to make my own decisions. Maybe I should talk to Ellie about this, I said, standing up from the kitchen island. Get her perspective on the legal implications. Aaron stepped between me and the door, not quite blocking my path but making his intention clear. Mom, I really don't think that's necessary. This is family business. We don't need to involve strangers. Ellie isn't a stranger. She's been my friend for 40 years. Fine, Aaron said, his mask of patience slipping another notch. But whatever she tells you, remember that Claire and I are the ones who've been taking care of you. We're the ones who opened our home when you had nowhere else to go. We're the ones who've been handling your finances, managing your medical care, making sure you're safe and fed and housed. Safe and fed and housed. Like a pet or a prisoner. I know exactly what you've been doing, I said quietly. Something in my tone must have alarmed them, because both Aaron and Claire suddenly looked like prey animals sensing a predator nearby. What do you mean? Claire asked, her voice carefully controlled. I mean, I know about the bank accounts, the transfers, the pension payments, all of it. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock ticking on the wall, my own heart beating in my ears. Aaron recovered first, his expression shifting from alarm to patronizing concern. Mom, I think you're confused. Maybe those new medications are affecting your memory more than we realized. but I could see the calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of damage control options. How much did I know? How much could I prove? What would it take to discredit me before I could take action? I'm not confused, I said, and I'm done being grateful for abuse. I walked toward the door, and this time Aaron didn't try to stop me, but his voice followed me across the kitchen, carrying a threat wrapped in concern. Mom, I hope you'll be very careful about who you trust. There are people out there who prey on elderly women, who convince them their own families are the enemy. People who might try to take advantage of your vulnerability. I turned back to look at him one last time. My son, who'd spent 3 years convincing me I was lucky to have family willing to tolerate my existence while he systematically stole everything I'd worked for. Aaron, I said, I already know exactly who's been preying on me. Then I walked out of the house and across the yard to the shed, where Ellie was waiting with the tools I'd need to fight back. Back in the shed, Ellie was pacing the small space like a caged tiger, her briefcase open and documents organized into precise stacks on the card table. Her paralegal instincts had kicked into high gear, and I could see the wheels turning behind her sharp brown eyes. I heard raised voices, she said without preamble. Are you all right? They want me to sign power of attorney papers, I said, sinking onto the cot with legs that suddenly felt unsteady. Today, right now. They've already picked out an assisted living facility. Ellie's face went pale, then flushed with anger. The bastards. They know you're onto them, so they're accelerating their timeline. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. We need to move fast, Margaret. Once they realize how much evidence you have, they'll start covering their tracks. For the next hour, Ellie walked me through what she called financial triage. Immediate steps to stop the bleeding before we could address the larger wounds. First, we called the bank's fraud hotline from her phone, reporting unauthorized access to my accounts. The customer service representative was professional but clearly skeptical until Ellie identified herself as my legal advocate and began rattling off account numbers and suspicious transaction dates with the precision of someone who'd spent 4 decades navigating financial institutions. Mrs. O'Sullivan, we're going to place an immediate hold on all accounts pending investigation, the representative finally said. No one will be able to access these funds until we verify the legitimate account holder's identity and intentions. The relief was so overwhelming, I started crying right there in the shed, tears streaming down my face while Ellie rubbed my shoulder and continued taking notes. 3 years of watching my life savings disappear, and it had taken one phone call to stop it. Next, we called Social Security to report the fraudulent redirection of my pension payments. This conversation was more complex, requiring documentation and formal complaints. But the representative assured us that the payments could be redirected back to my personal account within 2 weeks. Now comes the hard part, Ellie said, closing her phone and looking at me with the expression of someone about to deliver difficult news. We need to get you out of here, today, before they realize what's happening and try to stop you. The thought of leaving terrified me more than staying. For 18 months, this shed had been my entire world. Miserable as it was, it represented safety, routine, the illusion of family, even if that family treated me like a burden. Where would I go? How would I survive on my own at 76, with arthritis and a bad hip and 3 years of conditioning that had convinced me I couldn't manage basic adult responsibilities? I can't, I whispered. I don't have anywhere to go. I don't even have enough clothes for more than a few days. You're coming home with me, Ellie said firmly. I have a guest room that's been empty since my daughter moved to California. You can stay as long as you need while we figure out permanent arrangements. I can't impose. Margaret, Ellie interrupted, her voice gentle but implacable. You spent 40 years bringing me coffee and listening to me complain about my divorce, my job, my mother-in-law, everything. You babysat my kids when I had to work overtime. You brought casseroles when my husband had his heart attack. You think I'm going to let you live in a shed while your own son steals your life savings? The kindness in her voice broke something open inside me. This was what genuine care looked like. Not the manipulative concern Aaron and Claire had weaponized against me, but real affection offered without conditions or expectations. We began packing my few possessions with the efficiency of people executing an escape plan. The clothes I'd brought fit easily into the single suitcase I'd arrived with 18 months earlier. My books, the photo albums Aaron had deemed worthless, the small mementos I'd salvaged from my former life, everything that mattered to me could be carried in 2 trips to Ellie's car. As we loaded the last box, I heard the back door of the main house slam open. Aaron stood on the porch, his face dark with anger, and something that looked like panic. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Why are you packing?" I straightened up slowly, my hands steady for the first time in months. "I'm leaving, Aaron." "Leaving?" He walked toward us with the stride of someone accustomed to intimidating people into compliance. "You can't leave. Where would you go? You don't have anywhere else." The casual cruelty of that statement, the assumption that I was so worthless no one else would want me, might have destroyed me a week ago. Now it just confirmed everything I'd learned about the person my son had become. "I'm staying with Ellie," I said calmly. Aaron's gaze shifted to my friend, and I saw him calculating whether she represented a manageable threat or a serious problem. "Mrs. Martinez, I appreciate your concern for my mother, but she's not well. She's been having episodes of confusion, memory problems. Her doctor thinks she might be developing dementia." Ellie stepped forward, and despite being 8 inches shorter than Aaron, she suddenly seemed to tower over him. "I've known Margaret for 40 years, Mr. Morrison. Her mind is as sharp as it ever was. What she's been having is a normal reaction to systematic emotional and financial abuse." Aaron's face flushed red. "That's ridiculous. We've been taking care of her, giving her a place to live, managing her finances because she can't handle them herself." "Managing her finances?" Ellie's voice could have cut glass. "Is that what you call stealing her pension payments? Draining her savings account? Using her credit cards for personal expenses?" The silence that followed was pregnant with menace. Aaron looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "I don't know what she's told you," he said finally, "but my mother tends to exaggerate. She gets confused about financial matters." "I don't get confused about bank statements," I said quietly, "or transaction records, or the power of attorney papers you prepared without my knowledge." Aaron's expression shifted from anger to something closer to fear. "Mom, we need to talk about this privately. Family business shouldn't involve outsiders." Family business?" The words came out louder than I'd intended, carrying 3 years of suppressed rage and pain. "Is that what you call stealing from me? Family business? Making me live in a shed while you buy luxury cars with my money? Family business?" Claire appeared on the porch, drawn by the raised voices. She took in the scene. My packed belongings, Ellie's protective stance, Aaron's obvious distress, and I saw her mental wheels spinning, calculating damage control strategies. "Margaret, honey," she said in the soothing voice she used when Tyler had tantrums as a child, "let's all calm down and talk about this rationally. I think there's been some misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," I said, "was mine. I understood that family meant love, loyalty, mutual respect. What you've shown me is that family can also mean exploitation, manipulation, and theft." "You're being dramatic," Aaron said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We've given you everything you need. Food, shelter, medical care. You've given me a shed and table scraps while spending my life savings on yourselves," I replied. "The only thing you've managed effectively is making me feel grateful for abuse." Tyler appeared in the doorway behind his parents, his face a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. Seeing him, my grandson who'd been taught to see me as a burden rather than a person, gave me a moment of doubt. Was I destroying his family? Breaking apart relationships that might be salvaged with time and patience? Then I remembered the conversation I'd overheard. Tyler telling his friends about the senile grandmother living in their backyard shed. I thought about all the times he'd walked past me without acknowledgement, all the family conversations I'd been excluded from, all the holidays and celebrations where I'd been invisible. "Tyler," I said gently, "someday you'll understand that people who love you don't make you live in sheds while they spend your money on themselves. And people who respect you don't call you senile behind your back." Tyler's face went bright red. He looked at his parents as if seeking guidance, but both Aaron and Claire were too focused on damage control to offer him support. "We can work this out," Aaron said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Mom, you don't understand the full financial picture. There are tax implications, legal complexities. If you just let me explain, I understand perfectly, I said. I understand that you've been stealing from me for 3 years while convincing me I should be grateful for the privilege. I understand that you've been documenting my mental decline to justify taking control of my remaining assets. I understand that you see me as a resource to be depleted rather than a person to be loved. Ellie placed a gentle hand on my arm. Margaret, we should go. We have appointments to keep. Appointments, bank visits, legal consultations, police reports. The machinery of justice that would unravel 3 years of systematic theft and abuse. Aaron seemed to understand that this wasn't a temporary rebellion that could be managed with patience and manipulation. This was the end of his access to my money, his control over my life, his ability to present himself as the dutiful son caring for his aging mother. If you do this, he said, his voice low and threatening, you'll destroy this family. Tyler's college fund, our mortgage, everything we've built. It all depends on the financial arrangements we've made together. Built. Together. As if I'd been a willing partner in my own exploitation. Aaron, I said, picking up my suitcase and walking toward Ellie's car. The only thing I'm destroying is your ability to steal from me. If your family can't survive without my money, then maybe it wasn't much of a family to begin with. As Ellie started the car, I looked back at the shed that had been my prison for 18 months. The single bare bulb was still burning inside, casting harsh shadows through the window. In a few hours, that space would be empty, just another storage room in the backyard of people who'd never deserved the trust I'd given them. Any regrets? Ellie asked as we pulled out of the driveway. I thought about that question for several blocks. Was I sad about leaving? About burning bridges that might never be rebuilt? About choosing my dignity over the illusion of family unity? No, I said finally, and meant it. For the first time in 3 years, I'm exactly where I belong. That night, I slept in a real bed in Ellie's guest room, surrounded by walls painted cheerful yellow and windows that looked out onto a garden where she grew tomatoes and marigolds. The mattress was firm but comfortable, the sheets soft and clean, the pillows plump enough to support my aging spine. But more than the physical comfort, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Safety. Not the grudging shelter Aaron had provided in exchange for financial access, but genuine security offered without conditions or expectations. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to take up space, to exist without apology, to sleep through the night without wondering what new humiliation tomorrow might bring. I was free. The phone calls started the next morning. Aaron, then Claire, then Aaron again. Each call followed the same pattern. Initial attempts at reconciliation, followed by guilt trips, then thinly veiled threats about my mental state and dangerous influences. I let them all go to voicemail, listening later with Ellie as we cataloged their increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. Mom, please call me back. We're worried sick. You can't just disappear like this. What if something happens to you? What if you fall or have another episode? Nobody will know where you are. The concern in Aaron's voice sounded genuine unless you knew, as I now did, that his primary worry was about his access to my remaining assets rather than my actual well-being. Each message was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my own safety over his financial security. By the third day, the messages had taken on a different tone. Margaret, this is Claire. I think you need to know that Tyler is devastated. He keeps asking where Grandma went and why she left without saying goodbye. He thinks he did something wrong. Is that really what you want? To traumatize a 16-year-old boy because you're angry about some imaginary financial problems? The cruel genius of using Tyler's supposed distress was that it targeted the one vulnerability they knew I still possessed, my love for my grandson. But I remembered Tyler's embarrassed silence when I'd confronted him about calling me senile, the way he'd looked to his parents for guidance rather than showing any concern for my feelings. Claire was weaponizing emotions that Tyler had been trained not to feel, manufacturing guilt to manipulate me back into compliance. She's good, Ellie observed after we'd listened to that particular message. Evil, but good at what she does. The breakthrough came on Thursday, when my new banking representative called with news that made my hands shake as I wrote down the details. The fraud investigation had uncovered systematic theft going back not 3 years, but 5, starting just 6 months after Charles's death, while I was still deep in grief and vulnerable to anyone offering to help with complicated paperwork. The total amount stolen was staggering, $247,000. Nearly everything Charles and I had saved over 47 years of marriage, gone. Pension payments redirected, investment accounts drained, even the small inheritance I'd received from my mother. All of it funneled into Aaron and Claire's lifestyle while I lived like a refugee in their backyard. The good news, the investigator explained, is that we can recover most of it. The transfers were recent enough that the money is still traceable, and fraud protection laws strongly favor victims in elder abuse cases. But you'll need to file criminal charges for the investigation to proceed. Criminal charges. Against my own son. The words felt impossible, like declaring war on the very concept of family. But as Ellie and I reviewed the evidence spread across her dining room table, I realized that Aaron had already declared war on me years ago. I'd just been too programmed to recognize it. That afternoon, we drove to the Cook County Sheriff's Office to file a formal complaint. The detective who took my statement was a woman in her 50s named Rosa Gutierrez, with graying hair and kind eyes that had clearly seen every variation of human cruelty. She listened without judgment as I described the systematic theft, the psychological manipulation, the deliberate isolation designed to make me dependent and compliant. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Detective Gutierrez said when I'd finished, I want you to know that what happened to you wasn't your fault. Elder financial abuse is one of the fastest-growing crimes in America, and family members commit about 90% of it. You're not the first person to trust someone who didn't deserve it, and you won't be the last. The validation was so unexpected that I started crying right there in the police station, tears of relief that someone in authority believed me, understood that I wasn't a confused old woman imagining persecution, but a crime victim seeking justice. What happens now? I asked. Now we execute search warrants and arrest warrants, Detective Gutierrez replied. Your son and daughter-in-law will be charged with multiple felonies: elder abuse, theft, fraud, identity theft. If convicted, they're looking at serious prison time. Prison time. For Aaron, the son I'd raised to believe in right and wrong, who'd apparently learned those lessons well enough to know exactly which laws he was breaking when he decided my money was more important than my welfare. The confrontation I'd been dreading came Friday evening. Ellie and I were in her kitchen, preparing dinner and discussing plans for my permanent housing, when the doorbell rang. Through the window, we could see Aaron's luxury SUV, purchased with my pension money, parked in the driveway, engine still running. Aaron stood on the porch, flanked by Claire and Tyler, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Behind him, Claire looked like someone attending a funeral, while Tyler stared at his shoes with the uncomfortable body language of a teenager being forced to participate in adult drama he didn't understand. We need to talk, Aaron said the moment Ellie opened the door. No, you don't, Ellie replied firmly. Margaret has said everything she needs to say. You should leave. This is between me and my mother, Aaron said, trying to push past Ellie into the house. You don't have any right to interfere in family business. I became involved the moment your family business became felony theft, Ellie shot back. And if you take one more step onto my property without permission, I'm calling the police. The police? Claire's voice rose to a pitch that suggested genuine panic. What are you talking about? What police? I appeared behind Ellie in the doorway, no longer the broken woman who'd lived in their shed, but someone who'd rediscovered her spine, her voice, her fundamental right to exist without apologizing for it. Hello, Aaron, I said calmly. Claire. Tyler. Tyler looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shame, maybe, or the beginning of understanding about what his parents had been doing. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that perhaps some part of my grandson still cared about me as a person rather than as a source of financial support. Mom, Aaron said, his voice taking on the tone he'd always used when he wanted something. We need to work this out. As a family. Whatever problems we've had, whatever misunderstandings, we can fix them together. The only misunderstanding, I replied, was mine believing that family meant people who cared about my well-being rather than my bank account. That's not fair. Claire interjected, tears beginning to form in her eyes. We've done everything we could to take care of you. We opened our home, managed your finances when you couldn't handle them yourself, made sure you had medical care and food and shelter. The performance was impressive. Claire had clearly been practicing this speech, perfecting the balance of hurt feelings and righteous indignation that might convince a neutral observer that I was the problem. You kept me in a shed, I said quietly. While you spent my money on luxury cars and kitchen renovations and vacations, I was never invited to join. You documented my supposed mental decline to justify stealing my pension. You were planning to have me declared incompetent so you could access my remaining assets legally. Aaron's facade of wounded concern finally cracked. Those assets were going to be Tyler's inheritance anyway. We were just managing them more efficiently, making sure they weren't wasted on unnecessary expenses. There it was, the truth finally spoken aloud. In Aaron's mind, I'd been living on borrowed time with money that rightfully belonged to them. My continued existence was an inconvenient delay in their access to wealth they'd already spent in their imaginations. Whose inheritance? I asked. Money that Charles and I earned over 47 years of marriage? Money we saved by working double shifts and denying ourselves luxuries so we could provide for our children's education and our own retirement? You're being selfish, Claire said, her mask slipping to reveal the cold calculation underneath. You're old. You don't need all that money just to survive. But Tyler has his whole life ahead of him. College tuition, starting a career, buying a house. Don't you want what's best for your grandson? The manipulation was so blatant, it was almost insulting. They'd stolen over $1 million from me while I lived in poverty, and now they wanted me to feel guilty for depriving Tyler of money that was never his to begin with. What I want, I said, is for Tyler to learn that stealing is wrong, that elderly people deserve respect, and that family members don't exploit each other for financial gain. Apparently, those are lessons you never taught him. Tyler's face flushed red, and for the first time since arriving, he spoke. Grandma, I didn't know. I didn't understand what was really happening. They said you wanted to live in the shed, that you preferred having your own space. The pain in his voice was real, and I felt my anger soften slightly. Tyler was 16, raised by people who'd taught him that my value was measured by my usefulness to them. He was as much a victim of their moral corruption as I was. Tyler, I said gently, I never wanted to live in a shed. I wanted to live in a home where I was valued as a person, not managed as a financial asset. Your parents convinced me I should be grateful for anything they were willing to provide, even if it was unfit for human habitation. Aaron stepped forward, his face dark with rage. You're poisoning him against us. You're destroying this family over money, over imaginary grievances. Do you understand what you're doing? If you press charges, if you follow through with this insanity, we'll lose everything. The house, Tyler's college fund, our entire future. The house you bought with my money, I corrected. Tyler's college fund that you stole from my savings. Your future that you built on the systematic theft of my present. It was going to be yours too, Aaron exploded. When you got older, when you needed more care, we were going to use that money to take care of you. You act like we were stealing, but we were investing in your future care. The lie was so audacious it took my breath away. They'd been preparing to warehouse me in the cheapest possible facility while keeping my money for themselves. And now they wanted credit for planning to spend my own savings on my theoretical future needs. Aaron, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. You stole over $1 million from me while I lived in a shed and ate table scraps. You documented my supposed mental incompetence to justify stealing my pension. You were planning to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs so you could access my remaining assets legally. Those aren't the actions of someone planning to care for me. Those are the actions of someone planning to dispose of me as efficiently as possible. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Tyler crying. Quiet, desperate sobs from a 16-year-old boy watching his family destroy itself in real time. Claire put her arm around Tyler protectively, as if I were the threat to his well-being rather than the person trying to save him from parents who'd taught him that exploiting vulnerable relatives was acceptable behavior. We'll fight this, Aaron said finally, his voice low and dangerous. We'll prove you're not competent to make these decisions. We have documentation of your mental decline, medical records showing confusion and memory problems. No jury will believe you over the family that's been caring for you. Actually, Ellie said, stepping forward with a manila folder in her hands, they will, because Margaret has documentation of every fraudulent transaction, every stolen pension payment, every lie you told to gain access to her accounts. She has recordings of conversations where you discussed manipulating her into signing power of attorney papers. She has evidence that you've been planning this theft for years. She opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, a clear image of Aaron at the bank, depositing one of my pension checks into an account I'd never authorized him to access. Bank security cameras, Ellie explained with satisfaction. Time-stamped, dated, correlated with transaction records that prove systematic theft. Your son isn't just a thief, Aaron. He's a stupid thief who left a paper trail a first-year law student could follow. Aaron stared at the photograph as if it were his own death warrant, which in a legal sense it probably was. This conversation is over, I said, stepping back into Ellie's house. Tyler, if you ever want to have a relationship with me based on mutual respect rather than financial exploitation, you know where to find me. But I'm done being treated like a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. As I closed the door, I heard Claire's voice rising to a shriek. You'll regret this. You think you're so smart, but you'll die alone in some nursing home while we're living the life we deserve. Through the window, I watched them return to their luxury SUV, the vehicle I'd unknowingly purchased for them while riding the bus to medical appointments they'd deemed too expensive to drive me to. How do you feel? Ellie asked. I thought about that question as their taillights disappeared down the street. How did I feel about choosing justice over family loyalty, truth over comfortable lies, my own dignity over their financial security? Free, I said. For the first time in 5 years, I feel completely free. 6 weeks after that final confrontation, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my new apartment and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Gone was the defeated, apologetic creature who'd lived in Aaron's shed, constantly hunched as if trying to take up less space in a world that had made it clear she wasn't welcome. In her place was someone I'd almost forgotten existed, Margaret O'Sullivan, upright and alert, wearing clothes that fit properly and an expression that suggested she belonged exactly where she was. The apartment was small but mine, a 1-bedroom unit in a senior living community called Riverside Gardens, overlooking the Chicago River. Not the kind of facility Aaron and Claire had threatened me with, but an independent living complex where residents maintained their own apartments while having access to social activities, meal plans if desired, and emergency medical support. Most importantly, it was a place where I'd chosen to live rather than been warehoused by people who saw me as a burden. The decision to move here had come after 3 weeks of staying with Ellie, during which we'd spent countless hours planning what the rest of my life might look like. The bank had frozen Aaron and Claire's access to my remaining funds, and the insurance company had begun the process of recovering the stolen money. But more than financial security, I needed to rebuild my sense of self as someone capable of independent living. I know you're welcome to stay as long as you want, Ellie had said one morning over coffee, but I think you need your own space. Not because I want you to leave, but because you need to prove to yourself that you can thrive on your own. She was right, of course. Living with Ellie, generous as she'd been, still felt like being dependent on someone else's kindness. I needed to know that I could wake up in my own bed, make my own decisions about how to spend my days, go to sleep without feeling like I was imposing on someone else's hospitality. The apartment search had been a revelation. For the first time in years, I was making choices based on what I wanted, rather than what someone else thought I needed. I toured facilities across the Chicago area, asking questions about amenities and policies, evaluating options like the competent adult I'd always been underneath the conditioning that had convinced me I was incapable of managing my own life. Riverside Gardens won me over not because of its amenities, though the fitness center, library, and community garden were appealing, but because of something I observed during my tour. In the common areas, residents were laughing. Real laughter, not the polite social sounds people make when they're performing happiness for others. These were people who seemed genuinely content with their lives, engaged in conversations that suggested friendship rather than mere proximity. Most of our residents are here by choice, the director had explained, rather than necessity. They want the security of knowing help is available if needed, but they value their independence above all else. Independence. The word had sounded foreign after 3 years of having every decision made for me by people who claimed to know what was best. But as I signed the lease agreement with my own hand, using money from my own bank account, I felt something I'd thought was gone forever. Pride in my own capabilities. Moving day had been an adventure. I'd accumulated almost no possessions during my time in the shed, so furnishing the apartment required shopping trips that felt like acts of rebellion. I chose a comfortable sofa in deep blue fabric because I loved the color, not because it matched anything else. I bought art for the walls, prints of Chicago landmarks and landscapes that made me smile rather than prestigious pieces chosen to impress visitors. I selected dishes and cookware based on what felt good in my hands, rather than what looked elegant on shelves. Each purchase was a small declaration of independence, a way of saying that my preferences mattered, that I deserved to live surrounded by things that brought me joy rather than making do with whatever scraps others deemed sufficient for someone of my diminished status. The most meaningful purchase had been a new bed, not the expensive memory foam mattress Aaron had claimed was necessary for his own comfort while relegating me to a cot, but a simple, firm mattress that supported my arthritis without causing the aches and pains I'd grown to accept as inevitable. The first night I'd slept in that bed, in my own bedroom with walls I'd chosen to paint a warm yellow, I'd cried tears of gratitude for something as basic as physical comfort. But the real transformation wasn't about furniture or paint colors. It was about rediscovering who I was when I wasn't constantly apologizing for existing. I'd started swimming at the community center pool, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. The water supported my aging joints in ways that made me feel graceful rather than fragile, and the regular exercise improved not just my physical strength, but my mental clarity. Other residents had introduced themselves, and I'd been surprised to discover how much I enjoyed conversations that weren't centered on my limitations or their tolerance of my presence. There was Eleanor, a retired teacher who'd moved here after her husband's death, and now led a book club that tackled everything from contemporary fiction to memoirs to philosophy. I spent 40 years reading what the curriculum required, she'd told me over coffee after my first meeting. Now I read whatever sounds interesting, and I discuss it with people who aren't grading my opinions. There was Frank, a widower who'd been a jazz musician before becoming an insurance agent to support his family. He played piano in the community room every Friday evening, encouraging residents to request songs from their youth and sharing stories about the famous musicians he'd known in his younger days. "Music isn't about perfection," he'd said when I'd mentioned that I used to play piano but hadn't touched the keys in years. "It's about expression, and everyone has something worth expressing." There was Maria, who'd raised 6 children and now spent her time teaching ESL classes to new immigrants, volunteering at the local food bank, and organizing community garden plots where residents could grow vegetables and flowers. "I spent 60 years taking care of other people," she'd explained, "and now I get to choose who I help and how I help them. Turns out, caring for people is a lot more satisfying when it's voluntary." These were people who'd found ways to create meaningful lives that weren't defined by their relationships with younger family members or their ability to contribute financially to other people's dreams. They'd discovered something I was just beginning to understand: that aging didn't have to mean becoming invisible, irrelevant, or dependent on the grudging kindness of people who saw you as a burden. 3 months after moving to Riverside Gardens, I did something I'd been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't quite worked up the courage to attempt. I called the local community college and asked about their senior audit program, which allowed people over 60 to attend classes without taking exams or earning credit. "What subjects interest you?" the advisor had asked. "Everything," I'd replied, and meant it. "I want to learn everything I can while I still have time." I enrolled in a creative writing class, a basic computer skills course, and an art history lecture series. For the first time since high school, I was in classrooms where my age wasn't a liability, but simply another perspective among many. My classmates ranged from recent high school graduates to retirees like myself, all united by curiosity, rather than divided by generation. The creative writing class became particularly meaningful. The instructor encouraged us to write about our own experiences, to mine our memories for stories that might resonate with others. I'd started cautiously, writing brief sketches about growing up in Chicago, working at the diner, raising children in a different era. Then one day I'd written about the shed, about what it felt like to be 76 years old and homeless in your own family, about the systematic process of being convinced that you deserved less and less until you were grateful for nothing at all. When I'd finished reading my piece aloud, the classroom was silent for a long moment. Then a young woman named Jessica, probably Tyler's age, had raised her hand. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, my grandmother is living with my aunt right now, and some of the things you described, I think maybe I need to pay more attention to how she's being treated." After class, 3 other students had approached me with similar concerns about elderly relatives whose situations suddenly seemed less benevolent when viewed through the lens of my experience. I realized that my story wasn't just personal catharsis, it was education, prevention, maybe even intervention for other families trapped in similar dynamics. The instructor, a woman in her 40s named Dr. Sarah Chen, had stayed after to talk with me. "Have you considered turning this into a longer piece? Maybe a memoir? There are people who need to hear your story, Margaret. Not just families dealing with elder care issues, but elderly people who might not recognize their own situations as abuse. A memoir." The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. For so many years, I'd been convinced that my thoughts and experiences weren't worth sharing, that my voice didn't matter, that my story was too ordinary to interest anyone else. But the response to my writing suggested otherwise. 4 months after leaving Aaron's shed, I had lunch with Tyler. He'd called me himself, not at his parents' prompting, to ask if we could meet. I'd agreed cautiously, still unsure whether this was genuine outreach or another manipulation attempt orchestrated by Aaron and Claire. We met at a small cafe near Northwestern University, where Tyler was finishing his senior year of high school. He looked older than I remembered, more serious, as if the events of the past few months had forced him to grow up faster than he'd planned. "Grandma," he'd said without preamble, "I need to apologize for all of it, for not seeing what was happening, for not standing up for you, for letting them convince me that you were the problem when they were the ones stealing from you." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt something inside me soften. Not the desperate gratitude I'd once felt for any crumb of affection, but genuine warmth for this young man who was brave enough to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. "Tyler, you were a child living in a house where the adults taught you that exploiting elderly relatives was normal behavior. I don't blame you for learning the lessons they taught, but I should have known better," he'd insisted. "I mean, making you live in a shed? Taking your money? Even at 16, I knew that was wrong. It was easier to go along with it than to ask questions that might make my parents angry." We talked for 3 hours, and I'd watched Tyler grapple with the reality that his parents weren't the people he'd thought they were. He'd asked about my new apartment, my classes, whether I was happy living on my own. When I'd shown him photos of my art history class field trip to the Art Institute, he'd smiled for the first time since sitting down. "You look different," he'd said. "Happier. Like yourself again. Like myself again." Tyler had been young when Charles died, but he still remembered the grandmother who'd baked cookies with him, who'd taught him to play chess, who'd listened to his stories about school friends and teenage dramas with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. "I am myself again," I'd told him. "For the first time in years, I'm the person I was meant to be, rather than the person your parents needed me to become to justify their treatment of me." As we'd parted ways, Tyler had hugged me, really hugged me. Not the perfunctory embrace I'd grown accustomed to, but the kind of hug that suggested affection rather than obligation. "Can we do this again?" he'd asked. "Lunch, I mean. Just us. I want to know the real you, not the version of you that my parents created to make themselves feel better about what they were doing." "I'd like that very much," I'd replied, and meant it. That evening, I'd sat in my own living room, in my own comfortable chair, looking out at the Chicago skyline glittering in the distance. For the first time since Charles died, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future, not because someone else had promised to take care of me, but because I'd proven to myself that I was capable of taking care of myself. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Ellie, calling for our weekly check-in. "How are you feeling about everything?" she'd asked. I'd considered the question seriously. How was I feeling about having my own son arrested for stealing from me? About discovering that my family had seen me as a resource rather than a person? About starting over at 76 with the realization that I'd spent 3 years living like a refugee from my own life? "Grateful," I'd said, surprising myself with the answer. "I'm grateful that I found out the truth before it was too late to do something about it. Grateful that I still have time to live on my own terms rather than theirs. Grateful that I remembered who I am before I forgot completely." And I was. For the first time in years, gratitude wasn't something I performed to make others comfortable with mistreating me. It was genuine appreciation for a second chance I'd given myself by choosing dignity over family loyalty, truth over comfortable lies, self-respect over the illusion of belonging. I was 76 years old, and my life was just beginning. 1 year later, I sat in the front row of a packed auditorium at the Chicago Public Library, holding a copy of my newly published memoir in hands that no longer shook with uncertainty. The book was slim but substantial, 200 pages titled Breaking the Silence: How I Reclaimed My Life at 76. On the cover was a photograph Ellie had taken of me in my apartment, surrounded by the art and books and small treasures I'd chosen for myself, smiling with the confidence of someone who'd remembered what it felt like to be valued. The audience was larger than I'd expected. Elderly people, middle-aged children worried about their aging parents, social workers, and legal advocates who dealt with elder abuse cases. In the third row, I spotted Tyler, now a freshman at Northwestern studying social work, a career choice that had surprised everyone except me. Sometimes the most powerful education comes from watching the people you love recover from damage you helped inflict. Dr. Sarah Chen, my writing instructor who'd become both mentor and friend, introduced me with words that still felt surreal when applied to my life. "Margaret O'Sullivan's story isn't just about surviving abuse," she said. "It's about the radical act of choosing yourself when everyone else has written you off, including yourself." I stood at the podium and looked out at faces that reflected my own journey. People who'd been taught to be grateful for crumbs, to apologize for taking up space, to measure their worth by their usefulness to others. These were my people, and for the first time in my life, I had something important to say to them. "When people ask me what I want them to take away from my story," I began, "I don't tell them about the money that was stolen or the charges that were filed, or even the justice that was eventually served. I tell them about the morning I woke up in my own bed, in my own home, and realized I could spend the entire day doing exactly what I wanted to do, without asking anyone's permission or justifying my choices to people who'd never valued them anyway." I spoke for 30 minutes about the gradual erosion of self-worth that makes abuse possible, about the difference between being loved and being tolerated, about the radical act of believing you deserve dignity even when everyone around you suggests otherwise. But mostly, I talked about hope, about the possibility of starting over at any age, of reclaiming your voice after years of silence, of discovering that you're stronger than you ever imagined. During the question period, a woman in her 80s raised her hand. "My daughter controls all my finances," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She says I'm too confused to handle money anymore, but I feel like I'm disappearing. How do I know if what she's doing is helping or hurting me?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Around the auditorium, I saw heads nodding, people recognizing their own situations in her words. "The first question to ask yourself," I replied, "is whether your daughter's help increases your independence or decreases it. Does she involve you in financial decisions or exclude you from them? Does she encourage you to maintain your own bank accounts and credit cards? Or does she insist that everything must go through her? Do you feel more secure or more vulnerable since she started helping?" I watched understanding dawn on faces throughout the audience. People who genuinely want to help you will always prioritize your autonomy over their convenience. They'll make sure you understand what's happening with your money rather than keeping you in the dark for your own supposed benefit. After the event, dozens of people approached me with their own stories. Some were elderly people recognizing abuse they'd been taught to call love. Others were adult children suddenly questioning whether their good intentions had crossed lines they hadn't recognized. A few were social workers and attorneys who wanted to use my book in their own advocacy work. But the conversation that meant the most came from a young woman who couldn't have been older than 25. "My grandmother is living with my aunt," she said, "and after hearing you speak, I realized some things that seemed normal might not be okay. Would you talk to me about what warning signs to watch for?" This was why I'd written the book, why I'd put my most painful experiences on public display, not for revenge or sympathy, but to serve as an early warning system for other families, other elderly people, other children who might not recognize the difference between care and control until it was too late. 6 months after the book's publication, Aaron and Claire were sentenced. Aaron received 4 years in federal prison for elder abuse and financial fraud. Claire, who'd cooperated with prosecutors and testified about Aaron's role in planning the systematic theft, received 2 years of probation and was ordered to pay restitution. The house they'd bought with my money was sold, and most of my stolen savings were recovered, along with interest and penalties that nearly doubled the original amount. I felt no satisfaction in their punishment, only a profound sadness that it had come to this. These were people I'd loved, people I'd sacrificed for, people who'd convinced me that family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment they chose to give me. Their sentences meant justice had been served, but they couldn't repair the years of relationship that had been poisoned by their choices. Tyler visited me regularly now, usually bringing homework questions about his social work courses that seemed designed to understand what had happened to our family from an academic perspective. He was writing his senior thesis on financial elder abuse, using my case as a primary example while protecting my privacy through careful anonymization. "Do you think Dad will ever understand what he did wrong?" he'd asked during one of our dinners. I'd considered the question carefully. "I think your father understood exactly what he was doing," I'd said finally. "The question is whether he'll ever care more about the harm he caused than the consequences he's facing." Tyler had nodded thoughtfully. "I've been reading about family systems and cycles of abuse. It's scary how normal it seemed at the time, how easy it was to justify treating you the way we did." "The scariest thing about abuse," I'd replied, "is how reasonable it seems to everyone involved until someone from outside points out what's really happening. That's why isolation is such a powerful tool. When you have no contact with people who would question what's being done to you, you start to believe you deserve it." As I write this, 18 months after leaving that shed behind Aaron's house, I'm preparing for another milestone. Next month, I'm moving again, not because I'm being evicted or manipulated, but because I've decided I want to experience something new. I'm relocating to a senior community in Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountains remind me of family vacations Charles and I took in our younger years, when the future seemed limitless and full of possibility. Ellie calls it my grand adventure, and she's right. At 77, I'm planning my first solo cross-country drive, with stops planned at national parks and small towns I've always wanted to see. My new community in Asheville has hiking trails, art studios, and a writing center where I can work on my second book, a guide for families who want to provide support without crossing the line into control. The money that was recovered from Aaron and Claire's theft has grown into a substantial nest egg that will provide security for whatever years I have left. But more importantly, I've learned that security isn't just about having money in the bank. It's about trusting your own judgment, maintaining your independence, and surrounding yourself with people who value you for who you are, rather than what you can provide. Tyler will visit me in North Carolina over spring break, and we're planning to hike some of the easier mountain trails together. He's grown into a young man I'm genuinely proud to know. Not because he's my grandson, but because he's chosen to learn from our family's mistakes rather than repeat them. I sometimes think about the woman I was 5 years ago, sitting alone at Charles's funeral while Aaron handled everything for me. She was already being groomed for victimization, already being taught that her judgment couldn't be trusted, that her needs were less important than everyone else's convenience. If I could talk to her, I would tell her that the people who say they're helping you should always be willing to explain exactly what they're doing and why. I would tell her that real love doesn't require you to surrender your dignity in exchange for basic care. But mostly, I would tell her that it's never too late to save yourself. As I finish writing this final chapter, sitting in my sunlit apartment with Lake Michigan sparkling outside my window. I feel something I hadn't experienced in years before that night in the shed when I finally asked myself if I was being used. I feel proud, not of enduring abuse, but of recognizing it and choosing to fight back. Proud of rebuilding my life at an age when most people think new beginnings are impossible. Proud of using my pain to help others avoid similar situations. The shed is gone now. Aaron sold the house to help pay legal fees and restitution, and the new owners demolished the outbuilding where I'd spent 18 months learning to be grateful for nothing. Sometimes I drive past the empty lot where it once stood, but I feel no nostalgia for that time, no desire to return to the woman who lived there. That woman served her purpose. She survived long enough for this woman to emerge. Someone who knows her own worth, who chooses her own relationships, who measures her value by her own standards rather than other people's convenience. The best part of my new life isn't the apartment, or the friends, or even the book that's helping other families recognize and prevent elder abuse. The best part is waking up every morning and remembering that this day belongs to me, that every choice I make will be mine to make, that I never again have to apologize for taking up space in a world that has room for everyone. I'm 77 years old, and I've never been happier. Not because my life is perfect, but because it's genuinely mine. So let me ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever been told that your concerns were imaginary, while your resources were being managed by people who claimed to know what was best for you? Do you know someone who's being isolated, controlled, or convinced they should be grateful for treatment that would be unacceptable for anyone else? If any of this sounds familiar, please tell me about it in the comments below. Your story matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. And you're never too old or too late to choose dignity over convenience, truth over family peace, yourself over everyone else's expectations. And if this story touched you in any way, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Every subscription helps these messages reach someone who needs to hear them, someone who might be living in their own version of a shed, convinced they should be grateful for crumbs when they deserve a place at the table. Because everyone deserves to be valued. Everyone deserves to be heard. And everyone, at any age, deserves the chance to choose themselves.